Part 2. I found out about my grandpa's 1950s homosexual love story through his love letters. Edwin's perspective. "I'm gonna take a bath," Anthony announced, his voice a little brittle and sad. "Okay," I replied and looked at his bare back. He carried droopy shoulders these days, and it had started to feel like he was losing weight. The more I stared at him, the more I felt disbelief at his current state. He looked like your typical teenage boy. "Do you want me to bring you something from the kitchen?" He thought for a while and then gave me a sunny smile. "Sandwiches will do." "Thank you." I nodded and promised that I'd make him some. I knew there was something special about Anthony, so it wasn't a surprise when the thought suddenly rushed into my mind that, hey, maybe I like this guy a little too much for my parents' liking. In fact, my parents weren't even at the top of my head when I thought about kissing Anthony and loving him. The only person in my head was Anthony, and the worried face he seemed to carry around a lot these days. After both our granddads' deaths, something that we had seen coming but weren't ready to face, a sort of gloom had overtaken both of our families. My parents rarely interacted with Anthony's parents, and vice versa. The only two people who talked post our granddads' deaths were Anthony and I. In fact, we talked so much that our parents had started raising eyebrows at our sudden closeness. In passing, my mom even questioned if something is going on between you two. "I need to know so that I can stop it well in time," she'd said. I'd answered that Anthony was just a very good friend. I didn't tell her that I had a crush on my good friend Anthony, nor that I often stared at him with the same feelings as my granddad did with Anthony's grandpa. I knew what trouble it would bring. It was better to keep silent until I was sure Anthony felt the same. And beautiful Anthony, well, often looked lost in thought following his granddad's death. It would be a lie to say I didn't know what it meant and where it was coming from. I was pretty sure he'd seen me tucking the page as well. And, well, while he probably assumed that it was one of the torn pages from his Nana's diary, I assured him over and over again that it didn't belong to that diary. In fact, it was a personal note from my granddad that he'd left in my hands hours before he'd taken his last breath. The only issue, however, was that I couldn't tell him what my granddad had written in it. It was better for him to assume the worst of me than to know what I felt for him and then reject me for it. After all the weeks we'd spent understanding our granddad's history, I didn't want to come out as a pervert. That was the last thing I wanted, actually. Especially not after we had read some less than innocent words from our granddad's letters. Something I regret to this day. The only thing they helped me with was understanding my feelings for Anthony. And, dear God, only I knew how much I felt for him. Anthony was taking a long bath, so I read through my granddad's words again. I rubbed my fingers over each sincere word he'd written and wondered if I should take the chance. Well, the only way seemed to be to confess it all to him. But that wasn't really an option. Not with what had happened just now. The timing wasn't right, and I wasn't going to take a chance and ruin it further when I wasn't even sure about Anthony. I sighed and folded the note and put it in my pocket. It was no use musing over what I couldn't control. I had another important thing to take care of. Sandwiches. I was sure Anthony was hungry. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. Sometime later. "Do you think it's a good idea to visit their wedding spot?" It was past 7 p.m., and Anthony and I were out roaming the town as if we were great sages. We had had our dinner. Separated, obviously. Anthony's family ate dinner in one corner of the house, and mine did in the other. The tension was so thick in the air that one wrong word and we were sure our dads would start a screaming match at each other. So, without much protest, Anthony and I ate our food in silence. When they went into their bedrooms, Anthony and I sneaked out of the home. Now we were here. If not for the expensive flight tickets, our parents wouldn't be here. That plus the house issues. From what Anthony had gathered from the conversations between his parents, the house discussion was up. Our parents were busy discussing what to do with the house now that our granddads were dead. Obviously, they had no idea whose house it was anymore. But they needed to argue about something, and, well, that must have sounded like a good topic to them. When I looked at Anthony, he looked small in his oversized sweatshirt. It was true that in recent times he had lost a lot of weight. That, plus the gloomy air he carried about himself, was obvious. Even a bystander could take a look at him and tell exactly what happened that made him so. That only meant I wanted to take care of him more. "I believe this is a bad idea, but we can visit it." "Thank you," he replied and looked up at me. "I've been thinking about it for a while, but I wasn't sure if visiting it was a good idea. Not after, well," he went mum, and I didn't push him to say it. But I didn't need to because Anthony began a new conversation on his own. "What do you think he thought we hated the most about them?" "What?" I asked, a little confused by his questions. Like, did my grandpa think that I hated him for being with a man? For being a gay man? Do you think he thought that? And that would be absolutely insane to imagine because I'm the last person to hate a gay guy. I'm gay after all. Well, that was news to me. No, not the fact that he didn't hate his granddad for being gay, but the fact that he was, well, gay. And to assume I believed I knew almost everything about him, even though I wanted him to feel the same for me as I did for him. Now, I couldn't help but wonder if he liked me, or if he had a boyfriend. What if he had a boyfriend? Although it was true that Anthony never brought up that conversation between us. I hope he didn't think that of me, I murmured. I'm, well, gay. Anthony looked up at me in surprise, as if he hadn't seen that coming. His look brought redness to my cheek. By then, we had almost reached the wedding spot. Before I could say another word, Anthony was already running his fingers over the names carved on the tree trunk. I leaned against it and watched him with curiosity. There's a good chance they visited this place a lot, right? I mean, I replied and cleared my throat. There's always a good chance. Revisiting the old memories always sounds like a good idea. When Anthony didn't say anything, I sucked on my bottom lip. Anthony? I said, and he hummed. Do you have a boyfriend? I don't, he replied, sounding a tad bit shy. When I placed my fingers over the names as well, he looked up at me. Why? I don't have one either, I replied. That sounds bad. You're a nice guy. You're a nice guy too, I replied. And, well, it was only natural when I cornered him against the tree trunk and kissed him. When he kissed me back, it felt like a well-practiced dance. Sometime later. I've read through my Nana's diary twice now, Anthony said, his hand wrapped in mine. But I don't understand anything. The only tension I could feel was between her and my dad. What if the real issue was with them? I asked. He furrowed his eyebrows. Whatever does that mean? We know most of the problems started when our granddads left our grannies. Or, well, when our dads found out they were gay and hated them for it. But I don't think anything really happened between Nana and Dad. What if something did, though? I mused and then turned to him. We were still walking, and it was well past 8. The town was ready to go to sleep, and the silence around was a little more than welcomed now that I knew I could hold his hand. Even if not in front of our parents, I was free to do that now. Do you reckon our grannies were all right with the fact that our granddads were gay? As in, if they were supportive of gay people or okay with the fact that their husbands didn't really love or desire them? The former one, I replied and cringed a little at the latter implication. I was sure it would be hard to get over the idea that our granddads were still in love with each other. I wondered if my Nana knew what my granddad was doing behind her back. Definitely the former one. To soothe him, I ran my thumb over his knuckles. He seemed to relax a little at the gentle touch. The very idea that I could be comforting to him brought happiness to me. It was almost feeling the same thing that my granddad said he'd felt for Adam. It was nice knowing we were connected in some way. Or in the fact that even my parents had absolutely no idea that I was gay. Just like they didn't have any idea until my granddad confessed his love for Adam, or whatever the hell happened in the 70s. I was sure Anthony was as anxious to know what happened then as I was. I found nothing to make an assumption on. We don't have any pages, and I don't really know where to look for them. Maybe we can search their bedroom, I suggested and looked at him. That would be so rude, he replied. Yeah, but it's not like they're alive. Before he could say anything else, we'd reached the local post office. And like a splendid surprise, I found the same guy who'd shown me my granddad's letters standing in front of it, smoking. It was a bizarre scene. Almost everything else looked silent and still, but here he was. Want to see if we can find something else about them? I asked, and dragged Anthony towards the man without waiting for an answer. I knew he wanted to know about everything as much as I did. Hey, I said to the man, and he looked up. I'm the guy, the one who asked for the letters? Edwin. This is Anthony, my, friend. I wasn't sure what to call him. I wasn't sure if I was allowed to say that particular word for him, so I didn't. In return, Anthony pulled his hand out of my hold. Adam's grandson, he clarified. Of course I remember you, the man answered, looking at me. You're still here? Haven't they been dead for a while? Yeah, but would you be kind enough to answer our questions? I'm hungry, the man replied. On me, I replied. I was sure the bar was open. And drinks, the man added. I sighed. I could feel a headache coming. Beside me, Anthony shifted, probably just as annoyed as I was. What was so difficult about answering a few things over some good food? Drinks on me. I don't drink, Anthony replied. I don't either, I replied, and that was a lie. I drank. Not often, but I knew my drinks. It's just for him. Okay, Anthony replied. I carefully took his hand in mine and was delighted to find out that it didn't repel him. Instead, he let me touch him. Ahead of us, the man scoffed. When I asked him if there was anything he wanted to say, he replied in a humorous tone, History tends to repeat itself around here a lot, kids. In a way, I was sure what he meant. Sometime later. Do you think granddads Adam and Evan, I clarified in case he didn't remember, were faithful to their wives. Why don't you ask your dads about that? I'm sure they're eager to answer that. They've always been good at telling stories. You don't have to sound so mean about them, Anthony muttered. If that's mean, ask your dads what they did for your granddads. The man kept drumming his fingers over the tabletop, anxiously waiting for his food. And no, you don't need to worry about that. Adam and Evan were two of the most loyal husbands I've ever seen in my life, but obviously we all found out the truth later. They were good actors, he added. So they never cheated on them? Never met behind their backs? I asked. The man shrugged. I don't know about that, he replied. But I know Evan tried to contact Adam through the letters before he finally settled in this town with his wife, but Adam never replied. So do whatever you want to do with that information. I sighed and leaned against my chair. The man wasn't really being helpful. I wanted him to tell me more, and I asked him about the same, about the relationship between our granddads and our dads. But he had no good answer. All he said was that we should ask our parents. Well, I replied, sounding a tad bit mean, that's not really an option, you see. Why? The man scoffed, and a grin split his face in half. Did they lie to you too? When Anthony and I walked out of the bar, Anthony confessed that he didn't really like the guy very much. I agreed. He talked like a savage, he said, hinting at the often slurred words he threw at us. Most of his words didn't even make sense. Sometimes it sounded like he was speaking gibberish. We shouldn't have given him drinks until we had enough information on us. What do you suggest we do now? I checked the time, and it was past 10. If our parents were still awake, they were going to have a field day haranguing us over this little walk we had. Not that it was a little walk. Anthony and I had been out of the house for hours now, a fact that I knew would bother them. Anthony shrugged, but when we reached the house, we had our answer. I don't think you two should sleep in the same bedroom, Anthony's dad muttered and shook his head gravely. How about you sleep in your, granddad's bedroom? He suggested it to me. I don't think that's a good idea, my dad replied. When it looked like they would start arguing at such a late hour, I sighed and told them I would sleep in our granddad's bedroom. We had other bedrooms in the house, but they weren't clean. It would take days to clean them. See? Anthony's dad said. Your son's better than you. Anthony didn't really speak much, but before I knew it, he had slipped from my side and had locked himself in the bedroom. I messaged him, "Are you all right?" But I never received a reply. I simply assumed he was upset about something, but God knew I couldn't tell why. When I stepped into our granddad's bedroom, I couldn't help but spend my first 10 minutes looking for the pages that we couldn't find in Anthony's Nana's diary. But there wasn't anything on the bedside table, or the dresser, or even on the study table. Tired out of my mind, I dropped down on the bed and fell asleep. This was the same bed where my granddad had died days earlier. A few days later, Anthony and I didn't really have to put much effort into talking to our parents. A few days after that impromptu meeting with the old man, Anthony's dad began on his own. Both the families were settled in the living room, a rare occurrence in my opinion. What are we gonna do with this place? He asked. Sell it? Call a lawyer? See who it belongs to now that they're dead? It was my dad. I think you should just leave it as it is, I replied. It's not like it's hurting anyone, Anthony agreed. It's just here, he shrugged. Anthony, please keep your mouth shut. It was Anthony's dad, John. It pissed me off that he was talking to him like that. Anthony often said that his dad was definitely grieving, and talking rudely to others was one of his coping mechanisms. But that didn't mean he had to deal with it all the time. It had been over a week since the tragedy. I believe John should know better than to blame his pain and guilt on someone else. Please don't talk to him like that, Uncle, I replied. Edwin, my dad said, but John just shook his head. What's going on between you two? Nothing that should bother you, I replied, a little irritated and a little defensive. I didn't want him to know anything about Anthony and me until we were sure we wanted to tell them. But fate wasn't on our side, and before we knew it, John himself muttered, I've seen you two holding hands. Don't you know that's not a good habit? Whatever the hell does that mean? Edwin, that's enough. Please go to your room. I should go to my room? Dad, I'm not a kid anymore. I'm a grown man. I spread my arms in surrender, a mock shrug. I was shaking, and I knew I shouldn't have said what I said next, but the words were out, and before I knew it, a tense silence had draped itself all over us. I'm gay, I had said before slipping away from the living room. Of fucking course I like holding a guy's hand. What's so surprising about it? Haven't you guys seen your dads doing the same? Before I was out of the living room, Anthony's dad seethed. It's all because of Mom. If she wasn't so fucking supportive of that, keep your son away from Anthony, Kevin. I wasn't sure what Anthony had replied, or if he had replied anything, but 15 minutes later, I found him rushing towards me. I was seated in the garden, and the sun was shining bright above me. It was annoying as hell, and the heat was pricking at my skin, but I couldn't care. When Anthony stayed by my side and then dragged me into the shade, I didn't fight. I liked when he touched me. I'm sorry if you're upset about that day, I said, and reminded him of the time when I'd introduced him to the old man as my friend instead of my boyfriend. Even though it made sense why I did that, I couldn't help but feel sad that it had unintentionally hurt Anthony. "It's all right," he replied. I didn't want to come out to a total stranger first before my family. I looked at him for a while. "What did you do?" He shrugged, though it was only now that I could see the tear tracks on his cheeks. He'd been crying. No wonder his face looked so flush. "Anthony, are you all right? Did something happen?" He shook his head, and I could see tears brimming into his eyes. I told them I liked you, and, in fact, I was suspicious that I loved you. My dad couldn't believe it. He looked at me as if I'd just murdered his favorite child. And that doesn't make sense because I'm his only child, and he loves me the most. Or at least I believed so. And then I confessed that I was gay. I didn't say anything and held his hand. When he still couldn't believe it, I told him that Nathan was my first boyfriend and not my friend. To prove. He stopped and shrugged. I showed them a few intimate pictures of me and Nathan, and please don't laugh, but he was into some weird shit. He liked clicking pictures while we were at the peak of shit. Did you like doing that? I couldn't help but ask. He shrugged again. I mean, I wasn't opposed to the idea. A thrill ran up my body, and he looked at me with a loud laugh. God, you are a pervert, sir. I am not, I promise, I replied, lying. Then got a little serious. Are you all right? I mean, I don't know, he replied. It feels nice to let it out of the system, you know? I've known of me being gay for years now, and I have had at least 5 boyfriends by now, and I wanted to tell them so badly. But I was always afraid of my dad, more than I was of my mom. Then this happened. He stopped and pointed at the house. And, well, it's good that it's out. My dad's such a homophobe, I replied. Whenever we talked about my granddad, he always seemed more upset at the fact that he was with a man than the stuff that happened between his parents. It's bizarre to think about it now. I nodded and agreed. What do we do now? Well, it's not in our hands, I could tell you that much. I know what's in our hands, he replied. Yeah? I looked down at his mouth. When he nodded, I couldn't help but lean down to kiss him. A few days later, Anthony was dipping his feet in the open water when I found him. He had run away from the house after a brief but loud argument with his parents over both his sexuality and the idea that he was with me. He had left the house before I could catch him. When I finally found him here, near the stream, I couldn't help but huff and drop down to my knees to take huge gulps of air. He was looking at me curiously, but I could still see his bloodshot eyes. He had probably cried a lot. It upset me that I wasn't with him when he was feeling so low. A feeling that I remembered Adam had felt decades earlier for my granddad, given the notes and letters we'd found. It suddenly made sense why that old man had said that history had a strange way of repeating itself. Who knew what else he had observed that Anthony and I were oblivious to? What if there was something deeper between us that we hadn't figured out even now when we were days into dating? Hey, he said, did you run? What does it look like? I asked, sounding a little mean and sarcastic. Thinking it would make the situation worse, I shook my head and sat by his side. Anthony, are you all right? I don't feel all right, he replied. Oh, Anthony. I pulled him into a soft side hug. Everything's going to be all right. I heard my dad talk to my mom. They've agreed it's best to bring the lawyer in this case. I don't understand what's so difficult about accepting that his son's gay, Anthony grumbled. It's not like it was a choice. Who the hell willingly wants to date men anyway? Hey, I said, laughing, but I knew what he meant. I'm sorry, it's not about you, he confessed, blushing a little. But I didn't have the best relationships, and I often go back to all those memories at the end. And trust me when I say this, most men are trash. Most men are trash, I agreed. Our dads, for example. After a while, when Anthony was feeling all right, the conversation returned to the topic Anthony and I had been musing over for a while. It had slipped from my dad's mouth that his mom was supportive of our granddad's relationship. It should mean something. Until now, we had only known that although their marriage had lasted a decade or so, it had been a faithful marriage. In fact, our granddads didn't even meet each other until the 70s. But the fact that our grannies probably supported them through it? Well, that changed a lot of things. In simple words, it probably meant that our granddads never cheated on our grannies. It was, as bizarre as it sounded when I said it aloud, a mutual decision. Do you reckon now is the good time to search through their bedroom? I couldn't help but ask. Anthony looked at me and wordlessly agreed. When I kissed him this time, he returned it with passion. I remembered him saying days ago that they needed some privacy. And honestly, the more I kissed him, the more sense it made. After the lawyers came, our parents busied themselves in thorough discussions about what to do with the house now that our granddads were dead. But Anthony and I, for our part, decided to devote our time to searching through our granddad's bedroom. It looked like the safest moment, but we rushed through our search and realized that it was a fruitless effort. Nothing seemed to hold the secret of the diary. Tired, we fell on the bed and looked up at the ceiling. After a while, Anthony laid down on his stomach and I draped my free hand over him. He fell asleep, and it was then that I noticed a little steel box on top of the cupboard. Curious, I dragged a chair to the cupboard and reached out for it. It was very light, but when I dragged it, Anthony woke up with a start. "What happened?" he slurred. "Uh-huh. Looks like I found something," I muttered and shook the metal box in front of him. Curious as he looked, he sat up on the bed and helped me clean it. When we were done, we sat with it in the middle and looked at it for a while. "What do you reckon it is?" "It's my Nana's," Anthony muttered, and traced a mostly faded name on the box. "It's definitely my Nana's." I traced the name too. "Yes, it is," I agreed. It was locked and we didn't have the key. When it looked hopeless, Anthony brought a hammer and we sat down to break its lock. It was loud and we were messy. A few times I even hit my hand. When we opened it, there wasn't much to see through. There were a few clothes pieces and some buttons, the typical grandma stuff. Then we found a couple of pages. The state of them, obviously, was very bad. The pages looked yellow and mellowed out. They were torn at places and had several creases on them. But even then, it was obvious what was written there. As Anthony and I leaned against the windowsill, we found out the truth. It was so right in our faces. It was Anthony's grandma who'd first discovered the relationship between our granddads. Then she informed my Nana about it. The two discussed it over several months in the early 70s and eventually decided to confront their husbands about it. Luck was on our granddad's side because our grannies were progressive for their time. Over several coming months, all four of them discussed and talked about it and finally came to a conclusion. "She couldn't handle deception," Anthony said and rubbed a thumb over the page. "She didn't want to separate the lovers." At that time, my Nana was growing sick too. A few months later, Anthony's Nana started feeling unwell too. The doctors had given them some time to leave. Before anything bad could happen, the four decided to discuss it all with our dads. But it turned out that our dads weren't as open-minded as our grannies, and it created a huge bridge between all of them. By the time our granddads divorced our grannies, our dads had taken their leave and were settled in the other part of the town. Throughout the following years, it was just our granddads who'd taken care of them when our dads distanced themselves from their moms under the guise of how shameful it is to support such acts. They never returned, and our grannies died in their absence. Anthony's Nana died first, and mine followed 2 years later. "The idea of the divorce was your Nana's," Anthony muttered. "I guess she wanted to get it done with," I replied and shrugged, though I wasn't sure of my answer. "There was no bad blood between them," Anthony added. "No, there wasn't." So, it turned out that our parents had lied about something else, too. Considering how many lies they'd stitched since the beginning, even before we were born, I wasn't really surprised. But Anthony looked positively heartbroken. We'd unconsciously hurt our granddads. The last sentence on the page read, "For you, Adam. I hope you stay as loyal to him as you were to me, and thank you for all those loving years. I'll take those memories to my grave." The house was left in our granddads' names. Now, it belonged to our dads. Sometime later, Anthony and I couldn't hide what we found anymore. When evening set in, we brought everything in front of our parents and asked them to explain themselves. Our dads looked positively embarrassed, but agreed to tell us the whole story, and it made so much sense. They'd lied through and through to create the narrative that only our granddads were in the wrong. The truth, however, was that our dads had left our grannies the moment they turned 18. Around the same time, they discovered the history of our granddads. To cover the shame and to hide the guilt, they told us a made-up story. Because we had nothing to confirm it from, they kept it going for several years. Now, it was finally out. "If it's any comfort," Anthony's dad said, "we're not selling it." "Good, because I am not coming with you," Anthony replied. "I'm gonna stay here too," I replied. "But no." "Dad, I'm gay," Anthony muttered, sounding tired. "It's time you accept it and move on. You've done enough damage in a relationship." "Same goes for you," I replied and nodded at my dad. "Guys, can we talk?" John proposed. "If you don't like two guys kissing, I suggest you leave," I replied, "because we're gonna do more than kissing." "Edwin," my dad exclaimed, "you lied about everything. I hurt my grandpa because of you. You are the last person to tell me what I should feel or say or fucking do. Either you accept it or you don't," Anthony added. "I'm sure carrying guilt on two sides will be heavy for the rest of your lives, so I suggest the former one. But it's always your choice, unlike it was ours to love a man." A few days later. Always interesting to know our parents are in the wrong. I couldn't help but let out a small chuckle. "They hit it well." "Very well," Anthony agreed. We were near the stream again, a place that Adam had often said in his letters he loved spending time at. Anthony had his feet dipped in the water, and I couldn't help but be in awe at the sight of the water gently caressing his bare feet. It made sense why Adam liked spending time here. Everything was natural here, and nothing was fake. If we found my Nana's pages in that little trunk, what the hell were you hiding? I looked at him and clasped his hand. Were you doubting me? I was, he exclaimed. Sometimes I wanted to punch you, thinking, why are you hiding it? It didn't make sense to me. What was in the letter anyway? It's not exactly a letter, I said, and pulled it out from my pocket. After my grandpa's death, I always kept it with me. It's a note. My grandpa gave it to me. I didn't want to show it to you because I was worried you didn't feel the same. I showed him the paper. He smiled at me and slowly nodded his head. Do not run away from your feelings, Edwin. He read aloud. I blushed when he looked at me. What's this about? About you, I replied. Oh. I could see the blush rising on his cheeks. Anthony, is it the same about you? I've said more romantic things to you, man. What the hell? I gave a small laugh. I agree. I love you too. He smiled. I am glad this happened. Not their death, he hurriedly added. I laughed. I'm glad too, Anthony. Not about their death, he agreed. The same evening, Anthony and I returned to our granddad's wedding spot. We stood in front of the same tree that our granddads had stood in front of all those years ago and carved our names just below theirs with a sharp knife. We could only hope that our love would last as long as theirs did, and that we would die together. Conclusion. Our parents left soon after that. They didn't really have much to say about the new setting, what with Anthony and I now living in the same house they hated so much. But they did send messages whenever they could, claiming that they were working on coming around to the idea and were sure that they loved us regardless of anything. Anthony and I weren't sure what to think of it, but we were very glad to hear that. Anthony and I, for the most part, either read through the same letters over and over again, or worked on making a collage of all the pictures our granddads had left for us. For the next part, well, Anthony and I have become close in the next few weeks. The end. Do you believe in rekindling an old flame? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force and to stay wholesome.